Thank you, Mr. President, and since we're not in a quorum, I rise today to speak on a bill that I introduced. It's Senate Bill 1596. It's the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act. I want to thank my co-sponsors on this legislation. It's a bipartisan bill. Senator Joe Manchin and I have introduced this together, and I'm grateful to Senators McConnell and Inhofe for their co-sponsorship. This bill was inspired by a terrible story. It's a story of Jeremy Bell, and it begins at a school in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. One of the school teachers molested several boys and raped one of them. Prosecutors decided they didn't have enough evidence to bring a case, but the school was aware of what happened, and so they dismissed the teacher for this outrageous behavior. But then, amazingly, school also decided that they would help this teacher get another job at another school so that they could be rid of him. And they did exactly that, in fact, passing along a letter of recommendation, helping this predator get a job at a school in West Virginia. The story ends in 1997 when that teacher, by then a school principal, raped and murdered 12-year-old Jeremy Bell in West Virginia. Justice finally caught up with that teacher. He's in jail serving a life sentence for the murder. But for Jeremy Bell, that justice came too late. Mr. President, the very sad truth is that Jeremy Bell is not alone. Every day seems to bring a new report of children robbed of his or her innocence by someone they should have been able to trust, someone their parents told them they should obey. The numbers are absolutely terrifying, and worse still, the numbers are growing. On April 10th of this year, I came to this floor and spoke about the need to pass this legislation to protect our kids from predators in the classroom. And I explained then that since January 1st of this year, at that point, 130 teachers had been arrested across America for sexual misconduct with children. Well, Mr. President, here we are just over 3 months later, and that number has more than doubled. Since January 1st of this year, 275 teachers have been arrested in America for sexual misconduct with children. 275. These are teachers. That's more than one per day so far this year. And let's be honest, these are the ones that we've caught. These are the ones that have actually been arrested. These are the ones against whom there's enough evidence that they've actually been arrested. How many more are out there that haven't been caught or for which the evidence isn't yet sufficiently clear? The damage that these predators are doing is enormous. It's far beyond what any numbers or my words can express, so I want to let some of the victims speak for themselves. I'll tell you a brief story from Shannon. Shannon is from Nevada. She was raped by a teacher. The teacher was later convicted of sexual assault and sentenced to life imprisonment. 9 years later, this is what Shannon wrote, and I quote, "When I was a senior in high school, Mr. Peterson approached me and said I would need to go to night school if I wanted enough credits to graduate on time. And of course, he taught one of those courses, a computer class. I was 17, and he raped me 4 times over the course of a year. He said he would fail me if I ever told. He also hit me and made threats against me and my family. So I didn't. I held it in for a year and a half. In the end, 66 people offered to testify against Peterson. His first victim dated back to the year I was born. Some of those who spoke were parents. Their daughters had complained at the time, but nothing was done. That made me very angry. It still does. I learned that a handful of teachers and 2 principals knew about him, and his teaching license had been revoked in Michigan years before, and no one knew why. I'm different now because of what happened. I have to watch people all the time, analyze them. I can't be carefree. Now I have a 7-year-old son and 2 daughters, ages 3 and 1. I'll homeschool my girls. So when you see the number 275, remember Shannon. And remember that so far this year, there are 275 others like her. Or Gary of South Carolina is one of at least 29 boys abused by a teacher named Mr. Fisher over that teacher's 37-year career. Now the teacher is serving 20 years in prison today. 2 school principals were sued for allegedly covering up the abuse. Here's what Gary wrote about his experience, and I quote, "I was 9 when it started. The abuse was frequent and long-term till I went to college. I knew there were others too, but until it all came out, I never knew how many. You feel so guilty, so ashamed. It's frightening now to look back and see how calculating Fisher was. I did everything I could to get kicked out of school. I was in the guidance counselor's office all the time. Finally, in the 10th grade, I got myself kicked out for cheating. By the time I went to college, I was drinking all the time. I was terrified to quit because then I'd have to feel. But I couldn't drink and do school, so I entered rehab. I was 18. It took me a year and a half, and I've been sober since. My life is good now for the first time. You can survive it, but you have to deal with it. I always felt that what the school did was far worse than what Fisher did. Fisher was sick, an evil monster. But the school just calculated the damage to its public relations. We kids were dispensable, which is a whole other category of evil." End quote. So when you see the number 275, remember Gary. And remember that there are 275 others like him that we know of already this year alone. So what can we do? Well, my bill is a first step at addressing this. It's called the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act. It's pretty simple, really. It requires a mandatory background check for existing and prospective employees, and it requires that those checks be periodically repeated. There are 5 states that do no background checks. The second thing that my bill would do is it would apply to all employees of a school, employees or contractors who have unsupervised access to children, not just teachers. So it would include bus drivers and coaches. There are 12 states that currently do no checks at all on contractors. And the legislation would also require a more thorough background checks. It would require that school districts check 4 major databases, both state and federal. In my own state of Pennsylvania, for instance, if an employee has been a resident of my state for 2 years or more, then only the state database is checked. And we just don't find out what this person might have done in another state at a different time. The legislation also would prohibit what has tragically, it developed its own name. The name is passing the trash. This is the phenomenon of when a school knowingly recommends one of these predators to another school. As outrageous as that sounds, it actually happens. Some of these schools and school districts so want to be rid of this problem, this embarrassment, that they actually facilitate the person moving on to some other place, where of course these predators just strike again against some other children. That would be banned under this legislation. In addition, there'd be a prohibition against hiring these kinds of predators. Schools would not be able to hire a person who was ever convicted of any violent or sexual crime against a child, if they were convicted of a violent or sexual crime against a child. And there are a number of other felonies that would also preclude being hired by a school if you're going to have access to children. That would include homicide, child abuse or neglect, crimes against children including pornography, rape or sexual assault, kidnapping. In addition, a person who's been convicted within the past 5 years of a felony physical assault or battery or a felony drug-related offense from 5 years from the time at which those crimes were committed, the person would be precluded from being hired in a position, in a capacity where they would have supervisory responsibility over children. Now, the enforcement for all this, Mr. President, is the only way that the federal government can or should enforce policies like this on school districts and schools, and that is if a state refuses to adopt these provisions, then they would lose the funding that they get from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That is one of many, but an important one, of the federal government funding streams for K through 12 education. And no state wants to lose that source of funding. And so I think states would respond by adopting this very common sense series of measures to protect their children. Now, I should say this is a bill with very broad support. This so broad, in fact, that in the House, the companion legislation passed unanimously. There was not a single dissenting vote. They voted earlier this year, and it passed unanimously. We have bipartisan support here in the Senate, as I mentioned. I'm joined by Senators Manchin as well as McConnell and Inhofe. It's supported by child advocacy groups, the National Children's Alliance, the Children's Defense Fund, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. All strongly support this legislation, and I appreciate their support for it. It's also supported by prosecutors, the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, the Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association. As a matter of fact, there were 5 district attorneys from southeastern Pennsylvania alone from different political parties who wrote an op-ed, a very persuasive op-ed, arguing why this bill is necessary based on what they see every day in their jobs as prosecutors. And I want to thank those district attorneys: Risa Furman from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, Seth Williams from Philadelphia County, Tom Hogan from Chester County, David Heckler from Bucks County, and Jack Whalen from Delaware County, all weighed in favor of this legislation. And finally, there are teachers groups that support this as well. The American Federation of Teachers supports this legislation, and the Pennsylvania School Boards Association does as well. Mr. President, I don't think I'd be going far out on a limb to suggest that probably a huge majority of Americans support this legislation. Because one thing I know for sure as a parent of 3 young kids, my kids are 14, 12, and 4. And there's one thing that is the most important thing to most parents I know, and that is that our children be safe and be secure. And when you put your kid on a school bus, you expect that that child will be in a safe environment all day long, on the school ride, while they're in school, and on the way back home. And frankly, we owe it to parents as well as to their children to do all that we can to ensure that they do, in fact, have a safe environment, as safe as we can make it for their kids. 275, Mr. President, that's the number. That's the number that should give us all pause. It marks 275 tragedies that we know of already this year. 275 childhoods that are shattered, 275 families torn by grief, betrayal, self-blame, and it marks a failure on our part. This kind of child abuse can be prevented. We've got the tools to prevent this and to prevent so many children from being harmed. Again, last year, the House acted unanimously to protect children from these sexual predators. This is something we could have done a long time ago, Mr. President. We certainly shouldn't be letting a new school year begin, really in a matter of weeks, without doing something about this shameful number and without making sure that this number doesn't continue to grow. So I hope we'll be able to bring this bill to the Senate floor, and I hope we'll have very, very broad bipartisan support for it here in the Senate, as we already have in the House. And I note the absence of a quorum.